From the heartland of America and the gateway to the West, good morning, good evening, wherever you may be across the nation, around the world. I'm George Norrie. This is Coast to Coast AM. Later tonight, making your dreams come true. Here's what's happening. Israeli troops found a command center and weapons and combat gear belonging to Palestinian Hamas militants in Gaza's biggest hospital. Israel's military said in a campaign that stoked global alarm over the fate of the civilians inside. Meanwhile, the horror suffered by civilians in Gaza has intensified each day, and the carnage must stop, according to the United Nations humanitarian chief, saying this after Israeli forces raided that hospital. Howard Bloom has looked into this story for us. Howard, lots of misinformation out there.
It's a mess, but Israel has declared that it now has total control over the biggest hospital in Gaza, the one you were just talking about, a hospital built by an Israeli architect, Al-Shifa Hospital. Now, why attack a hospital with numerous buildings, a staff of 1,500 patients, and a reported 15,000 people seeking shelter? Israel's army, the Israel Defense Force, believes that Hamas headquarters, as you just said, is under the hospital in a military tunnel system that Hamas brags is 311 miles long. American intelligence agrees that a Hamas command and control center is indeed under the Shifa Hospital. Now, has Israel found Hamas underground military headquarters? Not quite. In the first few days of the Shifa operation, the IDF, Israel's military, says that its troops have uncovered concrete evidence that Hamas terrorists used the Shifa Hospital as a terror headquarters. In the hospital, the IDF has found grenades, military uniforms, and other military equipment. It has also located a room in the Shifa Hospital where soldiers found technological assets along with military and combat equipment used by Hamas. The IDF also says that in another department in the hospital, the soldiers located an operational command center and technological assets belonging to Hamas. But the real prize Israel is looking for appears to be the entrance to the massive tunnel system below the hospital. And Israel Defense Forces spokesman Rear Admiral Daniel Hagari implies that finding the tunnel will take time. Meanwhile, Hamas has reportedly moved its command center and its staff to South Gaza, where hundreds of thousands of the Gazan people have taken refuge, which means that Hamas has already turned the people of Gaza City into armor made of meat, into barricades of human lives, and into human shields. That Hamas strategy has killed a reported 10,000 Palestinians and has leveled half of Gaza City. Now, Hamas is doing this to the Gazan refugees who have headed south for safety. Yes, it's not just Israel who is responsible for Gaza City's destruction. It is Hamas. But Israel has a problem more deadly than rockets and grenades. Education in Gaza has been supported by the United Nations, and the United Nations has allowed the Gazans to educate their kids to hate Jews and to look forward to two genocides. First, a genocide of the Jewish citizens of Israel, then a genocide of the rest of the Jews in the world. If you Google, you can easily find pictures of Palestinian 3-year-olds dressed up as suicide bombers, and pictures of Palestinian 12-year-olds trained as child soldiers wearing ammunition vests, carrying assault rifles, and eager to kill. In the current attempt to clear Gaza of Hamas, Israeli soldiers found a copy in a child's bedroom of Adolf Hitler's Mein Kampf, translated into Arabic, with handwritten notes, including the note that, quote, it starts with words, it ends with Jewish blood in the streets. So Gaza's children have been raised since childhood to believe exterminating Jews and Israelis is heroic, and that education is paid for by the United Nations. Unfortunately, this education in hate is not limited to Israel. Walid Shubat, a Palestinian who claims his grandfather was good friends with a man called the Führer, the Hitler of the Muslim world, the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, claims this is also true about the education of Muslim children in religious schools in the United States. He calls his education, quote, the collective incitement of millions of children in school, in the social arena, in clubs, in the mosques, on the Temple Mount, in the streets, and in the graffiti. When I was 6 years old, he says, I go to school. We sing Arabs are beloved and Jews are dogs. So you can see, he says, it's not just in the Palestinian area. It's in Jordan. It's in Lebanon. It's in Cairo. It's in Syria. It's all over. So Westerners marching in the streets for a ceasefire, or the 150 people demonstrating violently outside the Democratic Party headquarters tonight, just a few hours ago, are not demonstrating for peace. They are demonstrating for genocide.
Well said, Howard. Thank you. Inflation slowdown extended through October, likely ending the Federal Reserve's historic interest rate increases and sparking big rallies on Wall Street. Meanwhile, the U.S. Postal Service lost $6.5 billion in its just completed fiscal year, delivering a blow to the service's hopes of financial turnaround. The Postal Service projected it was going to break even this fiscal year. Instead, they lost $6.5 billion. Let's check in with investment analyst Michael Shedlock. Mish, what say you about all this?
That's quite an interesting story, George. The Postmaster General, Louis DeJoy, blamed the loss on inflation and rising costs. Now, they had projected that they were going to have a profit this year, but that was really more wishful thinking than anything, but because a lot of that projection was based on a one-time accounting gimmick that didn't happen, so that was actually most of the loss there. They should have expected it. But the interesting part of this story is the U.S. Post Office almost lost about $900 million, almost $1 billion, because they're delivering less junk mail to people. It seems that the cost of ink and paper has risen so much that the people sending the junk mail are doing less of it, and that was the biggest hit to the single line item hit to the U.S. Post Office, other than the accounting change, was this loss of revenue of 8% decrease in sending junk mail. Now, this ties in with today's retail sales report. Sales were actually down this month for the first time in like 8 or 9 months in nominal terms. In real terms, however, that's inflation-adjusted terms, versus a year ago, retail sales have been down 10 out of the last 12 months. And if we look at just the hard numbers, spending is up on an adjusted basis of about $100 billion in the last 2 years. But inflation-adjusted spending is actually down. So consumers are spending more, they're getting less for their money, and that has driven more use of credit cards, and credit card defaults are up 2% in the last quarter. Now, if you want some good news, I actually have some, George.
Oh, yeah? Tell us.
All right. Hey, the Senate late tonight passed the House bill as is, so it's going to go to President Biden for signing. That means we're not going to have any political bickering over the holidays until next year. I think that's good news.
You got that right. Thanks, Mish. Appreciate it. In a moment, Garrett Graff back with us after 6 years. His latest work, UFO, the inside story of the U.S. government's search for alien life here and out there. He's next with us on Coast to Coast AM. And welcome back to Coast. George Norrie with you. Garrett Graff with us after 6 years. A hiatus, has spent nearly 2 decades covering issues of technology, national security, and major issues. The former editor of Politico and contributed to Wired and CNN. He's written for publications from Esquire to Rolling Stone to the New York Times, and now serves as the director of the Cyber Initiative at the Aspen Institute. He's the author of multiple books, including The Threat Matrix, Raven Rock, The Only Plane in the Sky, and Watergate, A New History, which was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize in History. His latest work is called UFO, the inside story of the U.S. government's search for alien life here and out there. Garrett, welcome back.
It's such a pleasure to be with you tonight.
And I have to compliment you. Your book on UFO, the inside story of the U.S. government's search for alien life here and out there, is one of the most comprehensive, detailed books I've ever seen on the subject, and I've seen a lot. Unbelievable.
Thank you. That means a great deal coming from you, because I know that you have seen quite a lot of books about this over the years.
How did you get involved in this topic?
So, as you said, I come at this, not as a professional ufologist at all. I come at this as a national security writer. And I got interested in the subject because since 2017, what I have seen in Washington, in the worlds that I cover day to day, are serious people talking seriously about this subject. And that made me sit up and pay attention. And there was an interview in December 2020. I'm sure you know the one that I'm talking about, where John Brennan, who had just stepped down as the better part of a decade of serving as the CIA director and the White House Homeland Security advisor. He gave an interview to Washington journalist and economist Tyler Cowen, and he said a pretty startling sentence. He said, some of the phenomenon that we're going to be seeing continues to be unexplained and might, in fact, be some type of phenomenon that is the result of something that we don't yet understand, and that could involve some type of activity that might, some say, constitute a different form of life. Now, the syntax there is pretty complicated and pretty tortured, but what I heard John Brennan say was, there's stuff out there that I'm puzzled by, and we don't know what it is. And that I heard that interview, and I said, there can't be that many things in John Brennan's life that he's puzzled by. But, he's just wrapped up 30 years in U.S. intelligence at the top of a few very powerful jobs. When he woke up in the morning and had a question, there were tens of thousands of intelligence officers and analysts and sensor networks and signals intelligence intercept systems and satellites and all sorts of different things that would be tasked with answering his question. And so if there's something out there that puzzles John Brennan, that's probably worth diving into.
Absolutely. And Sean Kirkpatrick, who headed up the government's investigation into UFOs, is recently retired, and he has said they're either extraterrestrial or some foreign government. Now, we know some foreign government doesn't have these objects, or they would have used them on us already.
Well, I think part of what is difficult to untangle in all of this is that we know that some chunk of, what I sort of colloquially still call UFOs, but the government calls UAPs, unidentified anomalous phenomenon. We know that some chunk of it is advanced adversarial technology. Chinese drones, Russian drones, Iranian drones. Because actually one of the few things that the Pentagon has said over the last couple of years, as it has sort of reinvigorated its study around UFOs and UAPs, is that it actually did discover a heretofore unknown Chinese trans-medium drone, which is to say a Chinese drone that came out of the water and transitioned to flight. So we know that some chunk of it is actually adversary technology. But it's also pretty clear to me from the 2 years that I spent working on this book, all of the histories that I've read, the witness encounters, the declassified documents, that not all of this is adversarial technology, that there is more to this phenomenon than any one single answer, and that the government really sort of legitimately is puzzled about, I believe, a major chunk of what this all actually turns out to be.
In your 2-year research and work for this book, was there any one single issue that surprised you, that you are now a believer in?
Well, so what I tried to do with this book is bring together sort of two threads that I think journalists and historians normally treat differently. both the U.S. military's hunt for UFOs here, and then also the evolving science and astronomy around the search for extraterrestrial intelligence out across the universe. And I think that journalists and historians have long done a disservice by trying to treat these stories differently. And the way that they sort of tell these stories, I think, traditionally is, there are the kooky UFO people here, and then there are serious, thoughtful, erudite scientists doing real science stuff out there. And of course, that's not true. And of course, actually, both of those threads are very closely related. And one of the things that just really surprised me in the course of my research into this and conversations with astronomers and scientists is just how much in the last 20 years the math is now on the side of the aliens. That the story, you go back into the 1990s, and we didn't know that a single solar system out of ours had planets, that any other star in the universe had planets. We now, of course, know that not only do effectively probably every star have planets, but we much better understand the scale and scope and depth and breadth of the universe writ large. And, we sort of better understand the mapping of the universe. We better understand, you have the James Webb Space Telescope, which we pointed at a single dark spot in the sky, a spot in the sky that we thought was actually empty. And the James Webb Space Telescope turned up 94,000 galaxies in just that one corner of darkness. And so we now believe, scientists estimate, that there are 1 sextillion habitable planets across the universe that exist in that sort of so-called Goldilocks zone that would be able to play host to life that was similar to what we recognize. So that's a sextillion planets, 1 billion trillion planets. You may believe that life is rare, you may believe intelligent life is rare, but once you get to sextillion planets, I think the math is on the side of the aliens.
Oh, there's no question about that. How many stories did you select for your book? There's a lot in there.
There is. And what I really tried to keep my focus on was the incidents and encounters that shaped and changed U.S. government policy and the approach of the government and the military. There are, as you know, so many different encounters over the years, sightings over the years. But when you zero in on the ones that really changed government policy or really sort of changed the way that people in government think about the UFO, UAP phenomenon, that sort of helped me draw some more reasonable bounds around the book.
And they're all compelling stories, Garrett.
Yes. And in fact, one of the things that really stuck out for me were, there's a particular category of witnesses and encounters that I find particularly compelling. And they are people like Lonnie Zamora, and I'm sure you know the
former police officer of Socorro, New Mexico.
Socorro, New Mexico, 1964. This is a local police officer who's out responding, who's chasing a speeder in the desert outside of town. He hears an explosion and spots what he thinks is a overturned car sort of out there in a ditch in the desert, begins driving toward it, is, bumping up and down through the desert. He sees 2 figures outside of what he thinks is the car. as he approaches, he determines it's sort of more of a like football-shaped craft, and the figures get in the craft and fly away.
And it was that case that got the project director of Project Blue Book, J. Allen Hynek, to believe that there's something out there. We'll talk more about that when we come back. And welcome back to Coast. George Norrie with you, back with Garrett Graff, UFO, the inside story of the U.S. government search for alien life here and out there. We were talking about the case of police officer Lonnie Zamora, and that is the case that got the late Dr. J. Allen Hynek, who headed up Project Blue Book for the government, to believe that UFOs may be coming from extraterrestrial places. Garrett, it was an incredible story.
Yeah, and as I was starting to say before the break, the challenge for me is that witnesses like Lonnie Zamora are uniquely credible, because what you had in his case was there were other witnesses who appeared very quickly, including a New Mexico state trooper who was on the scene just minutes after his encounter. There was some physical evidence that something happened, and it seems very clear that sort of something happened and upset Lonnie Zamora, and that he is not someone who sort of had previous encounters or any subsequent encounters, and in fact, he's not someone. He was widely respected in the community, well liked in the community, went on to sort of have a normal life after his encounter. And there's sort of no reason for him to have invented the story of an encounter like the one that he had. That's one of the things that stood out to J. Allen Hynek. It stood out to me reading that history and testimonials and reports years later. And there are those category of witnesses that you see over and across the years who have encounters, who have no reason to make up the story, and in fact have quite a lot potentially to lose for reporting a UFO or UAP encounter. I would put, by the way, those Navy pilots today, the naval aviators today,
that's right,
in recent years come forward with the same type of category. And to me, those types of encounters, those types of stories really are what convince me that there is something here that is real, that is worth talking about, and that our government should be more interested in figuring out what is actually going on.
When I first heard the Lonnie Zamora case, which occurred in '64, and I heard about it years later, but when I first heard about the case, Garrett, I thought maybe what he saw was a test landing of the lunar module, because this was 5 years before we landed on the moon. Maybe he saw astronauts testing this thing, taking off, flying down, and landing. And it sounded right, but then it hit me that, he saw something else.
Yeah, and in some ways, at the time, you could have said that was the easy, simple explanation. He was close to the White Sands Proving Grounds in New Mexico. It was the heart of the Apollo program, the heart of the space race. But the challenge is, here we are 50, 60 years later, we have never seen a craft emerge from the U.S. government archives. We've never seen sort of declassified evidence of a craft that operates anything close to the way that what Lonnie Zamora explains that he saw.
Did your research in this book convince you otherwise, that the U.S. government is holding back information?
Well, this is a complicated story, and sort of a complicated set of facts to try to untangle, because we know that there is a U.S. government cover-up about UFOs. There are sort of several obvious cloaks of secrecy that we know exist in this world. As we discussed previously, some chunk of these sightings are the U.S. government's own secret plans, projects, experiments, and operations.
No question.
The CIA went back and tallied up that they think almost half of all sort of publicly reported UFOs in the 1950s were the U-2 spy plane as it was being secretly developed during that decade, which was very much a UFO. It was a plane that flew at an altitude that planes did not fly at, that did not look like any known plane, flying at speeds that planes were not known to fly. If you were a commercial airline pilot in the 1950s, winging your way across the country and you saw a U-2 spy plane above you, that was a true UFO. And we know that sort of some chunk of today, you're sort of stumbling across similar efforts. We also know that there's a cloak of secrecy around, as we discussed, that advanced adversarial technology that's being tested against us by foreign governments, China, Russia, Iran, maybe other governments. And we know that because the Pentagon has said that it has detected some of this as adversarial technology. But the government just is squirrely about what its sensors pick up, what it detects, what it doesn't detect, and it doesn't really necessarily want to let on everything that it knows about some of these UAP sightings for the purposes of not sort of sharing with China and Russia what it sees and what it doesn't. So, you have sort of those cloaks of secrecy that we know about. At the heart of the government cover-up, though, I think John Brennan, as I mentioned earlier in the show, when he said in December 2020 that there's stuff up there that he's puzzled by, that he doesn't know what it is, I think that was an honest comment. That I think I think that U.S. government leadership is honestly confused and unsure of what a lot of these UFOs and UAPs actually are. And one of the things that sort of bothers me as a taxpayer and a citizen writing about this subject is the lack of curiosity and serious study about what these things actually are.
Unless it's going on clandestinely. It could be clandestine.
Yes. But I don't think that, when you see these high-level figures making comments that are sort of as genuinely puzzled as what John Brennan was saying, I think that there is at least some chunk of this phenomenon that they are still quite puzzled by, and I think that they should care more about what the answers are.
Do you think it's still conceivable within government that the left hand doesn't know what the right hand is doing?
Absolutely, and we have all sorts of evidence across the 80 years that I really sort of spent, or the 80 years that I really try to study in this book, of the government not knowing what the government was doing. You have the very famous case from the dawn of what was sort of then still called the flying saucer age, when Captain Thomas Mantell, who was a Kentucky Air National Guard pilot, is dispatched in a P-51 to chase a UFO over the skies of Louisville, Kentucky. And he is he and a couple of flight mates are dispatched, and they race after what they see as a giant object. This is January 7th, 1948, in the skies over central Kentucky. And Captain Thomas Mantell ends up flying, the official government report later is that he ends up flying too high in the sky without oxygen, trying to chase whatever this object is, and that he ends up passing out and his plane crashes and he's killed.
Yeah.
And there's a real moment of panic inside the government that, whatever these UFOs are, whatever these flying saucers are, did they shoot down Captain Thomas Mantell? Are they actively hostile against U.S. aircraft? And it's actually Project Blue Book, years later, about 4 years later, 1952, finally pieces together what they think happened to Thomas Mantell. And Edward Ruppelt, a name I'm sure your listeners know, who's the head of Project Blue Book at the time, figures out that there was a secret Navy research balloon that he was chasing after, and that sort of the Navy never mentioned to the Air Force that it had this capability, and that it had that he had died, chasing the U.S. government's own project.
It was an incredible case. What did you think of the late Harvard professor John Mack, who spent part of his career chasing down alien abduction cases?
Yeah, I spend a couple of chapters sort of wrestling in the book with the stories of alien abductions, and all of those names that I'm sure your listeners know: John Mack, Bud Hopkins, and others. And to me, it was one of the more fascinating corners of this subject, because what John Mack and Bud Hopkins and others who look at this phenomenon come away convinced is that some real trauma has happened to these people who report these types of encounters, that they that they share all of the hallmarks of trauma victims, and that there is not a shared psychology behind them before they experience their encounters. These were not necessarily people, for instance, who all had a type of mental illness before they had, reports of their encounters with aliens. Where I think I settle is, that at a certain level, we have to believe them, that they are coming forward and telling the truth as they understand it, that they have had some type of encounter that, at least for now, remains unexplainable to us. I don't necessarily end up concluding that I think that that necessarily means that they are being abducted by aliens, but that they are having an encounter of some kind.
Something's happening
with a force that we don't yet understand.
What is it about Harvard? Now we have Professor Avi Loeb doing his thing.
Yes, and I actually was did an event with Avi Loeb last week at the Chicago Humanities Festival. And, one of the things that sort of kept going through my mind was, the sort of main figure arguing against the sort of early UFO and early flying saucer age was Avi Loeb's predecessor, sort of the debunker-in-chief, Harvard astronomer Donald Mantell.
That's right.
And I was thinking about sort of how far we have come in astronomy in 50 years, that you go from Donald Mantell, who was the archetype skeptic, to Avi Loeb, who, is about as close to a serious believer as you can find these days.
When you read the context of the Bible, Garrett, and it talks about fallen angels and things like that, if you add in and replace them with extraterrestrials, it still makes a lot of sense. You know that?
Yes, and I think one of the things that it is very clear is that there, you go sort of through almost any civilization in human history, and they report weird things in the sky. And they, this is not something that was totally invented in the summer of 1947 by Kenneth Arnold in the Pacific Northwest. This is sort of something that humans have wondered about and struggled with for our entire existence. And to me, part of what makes this story so interesting is the way that it mixes spirituality and science. That this question of are we alone is one of the 2 or 3 most profound questions of human existence, right up there with is there a God and what happens to us after death. And I don't know that we will ever solve, those latter 2 questions, but I am very optimistic that we will solve that first question of are we alone. If humanity pursues it and we sort of give ourselves as a civilization the chance to live long enough to explore it.
What does your gut tell you? Are we alone?
I think we are. As I said, I think the math is on the side of the aliens. I think that there is probably life out there. I think there's probably a lot of life out there. I think there's probably a lot of intelligent life out there. I am not convinced yet that the math shows that we would ever have meaningful contact with them. And I think part of, to me, the challenge of untangling the myth and reality of UFOs and UAPs is that there can be incredibly important and world-changing answers and science that we discover about what UFOs and UAPs actually are.
It could be huge, Garrett. It could be huge. We're going to come back and take calls with you in just a moment on Coast to Coast AM.